And so often what we do with the letters of the Apostle Paul is that we make those the Gospels. Instead of realizing that really what the letters are is a journey for Paul and for others, because Paul still struggled with all the tapes that were still going on in his head. He still struggled with all the tapes. Now, I think many of us can relate to this. That those of us who have come from Christian traditions or who've come from places, that we all have these little tapes that run on in the back of our heads, that when we hear something that's a little controversial or a little confrontational or is outside of our comfort zone, we immediately run back to those places that we call comfort, but those have usually been the places that have persecuted us the most. And we see ourselves acting out like that all the time. I know that sometimes when I get my buttons pushed, it's easier for me to retreat to the place that I believe was comfortable rather than sitting in that place of discomfort and saying, I'm not sure about this, but I need to fit it and put it on and see how it feels and see if there's truth in there. Because we all have these little tapes that are running on in the back of our heads. And that's not just around our Christian experience, but it's in our experience of so many different things. When I talk to people who are in recovery, they often tell me that they have these little tapes running on in the backs of their heads that helps them to retreat to those places rather than moving forward and sitting with the discomfort of what that is. How do I embrace life differently today? Rather than, so we're all programmed. It sounds like we're having a little lecture this morning, and perhaps, but perhaps that's what we need just sometimes, is just to remind ourselves that we are, we're human beings having a spiritual journey. And I think the Apostle Paul was just like that. He was a human being having a spiritual journey. Now, he had an amazing transformation from where he was to where he had become. But the reality is he still had all those things going on. And we see that in Scripture. We see that over and over again where Paul is grappling left and right with all sorts of different theologies. When the early Gentiles were converting to being followers of Jesus, I just struggle sometimes to say they were converting to being Christians because the Christian church hadn't been founded by then. But when the Apostle Paul was struggling with Gentiles who were becoming followers of Jesus, one of the questions he had was, do they need to be circumcised in order to mark their transformation, to mark their conversion? And you see in Scripture it says, it's not about the outward symbol that signifies someone's conversion. It's the inward change in people's lives that signify the conversion to being a follower of Jesus. There's that other wonderful passage where Peter sees this incredible blanket of things on that blanket where he's been taught by his religion that he's not allowed to touch any of these things. And he has this wonderful conversation with God and says, I've been taught all these things are bad. And Jesus tells Peter to get up and eat, and to eat everything, because nothing that God has created is bad. Nothing is unclean. All things are clean. And we see this in this transformation from the faith of the Judaic history to the dawning of the followers of Jesus. There's this backwards and forwards dialogue that goes on. And yet 2,000 years later, haven't we done the same with Christianity? Haven't we set up a set of dogmas and a set of rules and a set of regulations that enables some people to be in and some people to be out? How many of us have experienced that in our lives? Yeah, see, we can relate to that pretty well in this congregation. Many of us have felt on the outside. Many of us have heard the old tapes every now and again. I said at the 9 o'clock service that I grew up, and some of you will know this, and I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I was a Mormon, an early convert to Mormonism in Great Britain, my family. Now, I was out of the Mormon church by 9, so some of the irreparable damage that I've seen happen in some others didn't happen in me. But the reality is that I know that my mom and my dad, they left the Mormon church also about the same time. And Mum and Dad had divorced. I won't get into the whole story because you don't need to know it all. And you can read it somewhere else. But by this time, we're out of the Mormon church. And one of the things that my mom, now she's been out of the Mormon church while I was 9, so it's a long time. Too many numbers to even figure out this morning. But my mum is now, she sees herself as a Christian, and she participates in Metropolitan Community Church and believes that this is her spiritual home. But every now and again, something happens that she'll revert to some old Mormon theology. And part of that old Mormon theology is that only Mormons will get into heaven. Now for Mormons, there are different levels of heaven. And you work your way up through those systems, and of course you get into celestial heaven if you are a signed up, fully fledged, tithing. Okay, this is really key. That you're a fully fledged, baptized, signed up, tithing Mormon. That's the way you get into celestial heaven. And when I first came out as a gay man, just in case people didn't know that, but when I first, I can do butch every now and again. No, I can't. So, but when I came out as a gay man, even though my mom knew that the theology that she'd learned was not necessarily truthful, she still struggled believing that we would never see each other in eternity, because only she would get into celestial heaven. Now, I didn't understand that because she was no longer a fully signed up, tithing member of the Mormon church, but that was her theology. And she struggled to think about whether I would get into that heaven with her and whether she would see me. And every now and again, just every now and again, she still stops for a moment and says, "Neil, will I see you in eternity?" And we have to keep going back over this whole theology and helping her to move forward. I always tell her, it would be a blessing if you don't, but if you really want to. Isn't it true? You see how we've set up these theologies to separate us all out. To separate us all out. And it doesn't just happen in the Mormon church. It happens in Christian churches left, right, and center. How many of us were taught that Roman Catholics are not Christians? It's true. You can't, those of us who came from those kind of more evangelical backgrounds, we were told that Roman Catholics are not Christians, they're not going to go into heaven, they're idol worshippers, they carry around statues, they kiss their feet, they wear rosary beads. Reverend Alex told me he was going to pray the rosary all the way through my sermon. We were taught that Roman Catholics wouldn't get into heaven, that they're not Christians. Well, I've got news for this progressive, radical, inclusive community of faith. They are, and they're going to get into heaven. And I want to tell you something else. We're going to be very surprised when we get to heaven who's there from all of the theologies that we've been taught throughout our history. You see, we have these splits and divisions even amongst the Christian church, and not just Roman Catholic versus Protestant or Reformed churches. If you actually look around, that's why there are so many denominations, is because we have fallen out left, right, and center about theology. And sometimes not about theology. If you remember rightly, when we were choosing the color of the carpet in this church, we talked about how some churches have fallen out over the color of the carpet that's been chosen. Yesterday at Brad's ordination, there was a wonderful Korean pastor, and we were talking away, and I said to him, this used to be a Korean United Methodist congregation. And he said, well, what happened? I said, well, wherever 2 or 3 Koreans are, there are 4 denominations. Just wherever, that's what happens. And, wherever there are 2 or 3 Baptists, they don't divide themselves over theology, they divide themselves over the color of the carpet, and so that's what happens in our world and in our community. And I hearken back to this experience of Jesus that says the church needs to be united. The church needs to find its way back together, and that somehow it has to find its way through the theologies that it embraces to find out what are the commonalities that exist across the denominations. And I guess for us as a congregation, it challenges us to think about what's our relationship with the evangelical Armenian church across the street. What is our relationship with them? And how can we build a bridge of hope, even though we may not agree theologically, but how can we build a bridge, not literally,